Joe woke up and opened his eyes and looked around. The sun was shining. There were little beams of light peeking around the curtains into his room. He knew it was time to get up, and so he got out of bed and got ready to begin his day. Joe got dressed and went in the kitchen. His wife was there. She was putting her paperwork together. She knew about teaching. And the ladies in the neighborhood, some of them weren't really teachers, and everybody had their children at home. So she was helping them with lesson plans and suggestions and arts and crafts materials and posters, etc. She looked up at Joe and gave him a wave. He waved at her and headed on out the door. Joe got into the car, started it, went downtown and parked it next to the bakery shop. It was Constantine's bakery. Constantine, in the age of the virus, had his own system for managing his work. The door was shut and locked. Joe went up and stood near the door and kind of waved. He was pretty sure Constantine was back there and could see him. And the buzzer went off and Joe went inside, the door shut behind him and locked. He gave Constantine a wave. Now, Constantine wasn't going to come out there and talk to anybody or get near them because of all of this. The system was there on the front of the shop was a card table with today's breakfast items freshly baked. There was a bucket, a plastic trash bucket, sort of, with a hole cut in the top of it. That's where you put the money. Next to the bucket on the table was a bowl full of some change. The system was you would take a look at what you were after and pay for it, and if you needed change, you'd take some change. This was all done with people that Constantine knew. It was a trust system, and it allowed them to work in the age of the virus. Bagels were there, donuts were there, cinnamon buns with icing, a raspberry bun. Joe decided, hey, today's a pretty nice day. He got the cinnamon bun and put $4 in the money bucket. The price was $2, but Joe was glad that Constantine was there and Joe could get some breakfast. Joe didn't really stay long because, outside on the sidewalk was that group of people there for breakfast. And it was Joe's turn. He had his turn and he should go. So he gave Constantine a wave. The buzzer went off. Joe went out the door. The next guy went in. Joe got in his car and drove off to the hospital. He ate his cinnamon bun on the way there, pulled into the parking lot. Now, Joe, because of his work, went around to the back end of the hospital at the service entrance where the air conditioning cooling towers were and the trash compactor. Parked his car and walked over to the door, tapped on the door. The guard was there and Joe waved at him. He opened the door. The guard said, "Good morning, sir." Joe said, "Hi." The guard said, "How can I help you?" Joe said, "I'm here for the toothbrush room." The guard went, "Oh, very good. Well, hang on. I've got to be sure you're okay. Just give me a second." Joe could see that he was typing on his computer. And the guard came around and said, "Okay, if you'll stand in front of this camera here, it's going to look at your face. It's not really a facial recognition, really. What it's doing is picking your face up. It'll look through the hospital's collection of pictures until it can find you." Joe's like, "Okay, I've done this many times." And eventually the guard said, "Okay, Joe, if you would just pull out your driver's license and put it in front of the camera." And he said, "You're in. It's all set. You're headed for the toothbrush room. Is that right?" I'm a toothbrush guy," said Joe. He said, "Well, I've got to walk with you." Joe said, "It's okay." He said, "But that particular toothbrush room, it's just about 40 feet down this hall here." Joe said, "I know where the toothbrush room is." He said, "Well, I'll stand here and watch. You go down the hall and go on in." Joe walked down the hall, and at the door to the toothbrush room, someone had taped a poster on the door. It showed sunrise with birds and flowers, and they had taken some tape and taped a toothbrush to it. Joe thought that was not so bad. He opened the door and went in. It was a windowless room, pretty big, really. And a collection of card tables had been placed out in the room. They were properly separated, as they should be, for social distancing. People were already there, 8 or 9 people, and Joe found an empty table and sat down, beginning to do the work that he had done many times before. There was one person in the room, a professional, a medical care professional. It could be a nurse, it could be a hospital administrator, it could be the pulmonologist, it could be a respiratory therapist. It just was somebody there that was a medical care professional. And Joe looked up and gave them the little wave. They walked over. He said, "Okay, I'm here. I'm ready. Let's do this." They said, "Okay," and walked off and came back around pushing a cart. It was a cart, and it had a little poster labeling it. The poster said, "The Cart of Broken Parts." And they rolled it up and picked one up and handed it to Joe, and he said, "Okay, thank you. I'll let you know when I'm done." They said, "Okay," and walked off. Joe understood the drill here. He'd done it many times. There were posters on the wall that went through it. There was a poster showing every part and a breakdown of all the parts, showing the subparts. There was a poster of the ventilator. There was a poster that showed how the ventilator worked and a poster that showed how each of the different parts worked. There was the "Here's what we suggest" poster that just helped people to remember what to do. Joe just looked at the "Here's what we suggest" poster for a minute, one more time to review. It started out with, "Look at your part. If this is a part that you've worked on before, then continue on. If you've never seen this part before, talk to the professional and let them be sure you understand." Joe had done this part. He was familiar with it. It was a pressure sensor. The next step was, look at the part, carefully turn it over in your hands, be sure you understand it and you see what's going on. See if you can see by looking at it what's wrong with it. Joe did this. The next step is to open the part up and take it apart. Remember, there really aren't a lot of these parts extra, so don't break it. You shouldn't have to force anything. There might be some places where it takes a little bit of strength, but if it seems like a mighty effort, you're probably not doing this right. Take this part apart and reduce it to its subparts. As you're taking the part apart, and it seems like there's places where it moves, move those a little bit and see if you can see what it is about this part that changed so that the software system declared it to be either a failing part or a non-functional part. Make a mental note of that because you're going to need to fix that. Once you get it completely apart, look at it and see what's there. Joe looked at the pressure sensor. It was pretty obvious that goop or gunk or just biological material had gummed it up so it didn't move back and forth easily as it should. This was the most common thing everybody ran into. Sometimes dirt, sometimes hair. Sometimes the little children had messed with it, but most of the time it was biological materials, mucus or blood, or just water vapor, creating a crud that goofed up the part and made it not work right. So Joe saw that it was on the hinge, and he took his screwdriver and pliers and undid the little nut and bolt and took it all apart down to all of it, as completely separated as it could be. He gave them the wink and the nod and a wave, and "I'm ready now," he said, "for some fresh water and my toothbrush." And they said, "No problem," and came back. It used to be that everybody would get their stuff themselves, but with social distancing and all this blah, 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 they will go and get it for you. They came back with a bowl of warm water and a bowl of fresh water and a toothbrush and some paper towels and a little container of Dawn dishwashing soap. And they said, "Press on, be careful, do a good job, let us know when you're done." Joe said, "No problem." Took the parts one by one, dipped them in the water, added a little bit of soap to the toothbrush, and softly, gently, but thoroughly washed each part and brought it back to a place where it looked like a brand new, fresh part with nothing on it. No gunk, no biological material, no crud. Looked at it carefully. He looked up at the poster. It said, take the part apart, look at the subparts, be sure that all of them look like they're functioning well and the thing could go back together again with no problems. Clean them well with soap and water, scrub them gently with the toothbrush. Rinse them well, rinse them well. Be sure there's no residual soap. Lift your hand, they'll come over, they will put your collection of subparts in a little plastic basket and they will go over to the sink and they will rinse it well, very well for you in warm, almost hot water. When they're done rinsing it and think that there's no more soap on that, they'll bring the whole basket back to you with the parts and hand it to you. Take your parts out of the basket one by one and dry them with the paper towel. Remember, don't get pieces of the paper towel jammed up into the part. That's not going to help anything. When you think it's all completely dry and clean and proper, put it back together again. As you're putting it back together again, be sure that the parts of this part that move like they're supposed to move and that you're happy with it. When you have it all back together again and it's sparkly and clean and seems good, let the professional know. The professional will come over. You and the professional will look at it. They have a little toothbrush and they have a pencil and they can put it inside the part and move the little parts around, the subparts inside the part. Be sure it all is functioning. Once you're happy, they'll say, it looks good to me. You'll say it looks good to you. And they'll bring over the other cart. That cart has a little poster on it that says, the cart of working parts. Someone had taken it looked like lipstick, and written there the word hearts. And it said, the cart of working hearts. This is where the parts went that had been brought back to full functionality. And Joe understood now. Joe had the good fortune and blessing that Joe never really had much to do with hospitals. He didn't get sick. He never needed to be there. It was all just a giant, bustling, industrial thing up above his head. He was down in the basement. There weren't even any windows in his room. But his suspicion was the cart of working parts went up on the floor somewhere. They had actually shown a little movie. And in the patient care room, when the ventilator gave a warning signal or actually failed, the software of the ventilator system would read out what part wasn't working. And they would go and follow essentially a drill where it depends upon whether the ventilator was saying, we have a warning, this is getting ready to fail, or the ventilator had said, we are failing. But the plan was that the healthcare professionals, the nurse, sometimes it was a nurse, sometimes it was a respiratory therapist, sometimes it was a pulmonologist, they would go and look at the software output and see what was not working on the ventilator. And then they would go to the cart of working parts and they would get that part. And there in the patient's room, someone would start bagging the patient, disconnect them from the ventilator and bag them. And while they were disconnected, somebody would take apart the ventilator at the level of the part that wasn't working. And they would take that part and put it down. Joe knew that part was going to the cart of broken parts. And they would go over to the cart of working parts and they would pick up the part that they needed and put it back on the ventilator, get it hooked together, turn the ventilator on to its checkup protocol. The quickie checkup. It didn't do the big advanced checkup. It took too long. It would do the quickie checkup. And the green light would come on and the ventilator would say, okay, I'm ready. And with that, the ventilator was working again and the ventilator would be hooked back up to the patient. They would stop bagging him and the medical care professionals would go back to their work. And they would roll out the cart of working parts. And someone would stay alive. Joe was working along. He usually stayed for 3 or 4 hours. The professional helping had switched over. Now it had been replaced with the pulmonologist, which was kind of always fun to Joe. Joe was a factory worker and understood mechanical parts. The pulmonologist, it could not be more obvious that he was exceptionally smart, scientific, and technical. It's not real clear how many physical parts he had ever worked with, but he was there, and if you had a problem, he would talk to you, and you and the pulmonologist, if you had a part that didn't seem right, he could get it fixed, or at least tell you about it, and you would get it fixed. And you would take that broken part and turn it into a working part. At this point, Joe said, well, my 4 hours are up. I got to go. He stood up, gave him the signal he was leaving, and walked out the door down the hallway to his car and went home.